fire the two guns whilst jumping through the air.
Does double always mean deadlier? Dual-wielding weapons has been a phenomenon in gaming for decades, and for even longer in wider pop culture.
I'll take two.
I mean, what says action-packed shootout quite like a gun in each hand? Other than a little slow-mo, of course.
While it's been the source of much frustration within many a Call of Duty lobby, Akimbo weaponry can vary from a sensational addition to gameplay to a mundane unlock as you level up a weapon.
But how practical is that offhand weapon, and what is the real history of twin gun slinging?
Plus, a certain keeper of firearms and artillery puts dual wielding to the test. While it's a common sight in games and pop culture today, historical accounts of dual-wielding weapons are few and far between, and even more so since the invention of the firearm. In early history, there are examples of dual-weapon fighters, from the Roman Dimacharius gladiators and Renaissance swordsmen fighting with swords and dagger, to the Japanese katana and wakizashi Niten Ichi-ryu sword technique, or the Chinese hook sword martial arts. These examples were very rare, especially when compared to more traditional fighting styles, and today the most common depiction of two-weapon fighting is that of a pistol in each hand. And while many of these weapons frequently came as a pair, their purpose was more for repeated shots rather than firing two at once. Although, just because dual-wielding your flintlocks was an ill-advised idea, doesn't mean that it wasn't potentially considered.
We have a set of Scottish pistols with what we call handed locks. So there's the pistol for the right hand has the lock on the right hand side as standard. The pistol for the left hand has the lock on the left hand side. We don't really know why. It's kind of implied that you might use them both at the same time, but we have no real evidence of that.
Cavalry pistols, for example, also came as a twosome throughout much of their history, where they were slung from a horse's neck for use one after the other, with the primary weapon of the cavalryman during those times still being their sword. But one of the oldest accounts comes in 1772, where the HMS Gaspee came under attack by American rebels.
The quote we have, and this is the repelling of the American borders, Duddingston, with his two pistols in his hands, jumped up upon deck, went forward and hailed them. They answered they wanted him, and by God they would have him, dead or alive. He ordered them to keep off on their peril. They continued to advance, and he fired his pistols amongst them. So he's firing clearly one shot from each hand, which hurt nobody. They returned the fire immediately, shot the captain in the arm, and wounded him in the body, of which it is thought he will die. So definitely not a successful attack with one gun in each hand. And the obvious problems there are very few people are skilled enough to even fire a gun in their non-dominant hand. You know, we're all either left-handed or right-handed. Some of us are ambidextrous, great, but even then, coordinating the fire between your left and right hand, your left and right eye, it's very difficult to do. There's a good reason for doing it with muzzle-loading pistols, because it gives you two rapid shots. Otherwise, you'd have to fire one, perhaps throw it away, draw for speed, draw the second one. Now, that's how the pirates would do it. So the classic pictures of Blackbeard, with period engraving at least, showing multiple pistols, that's how he got multiple shots, but there's no account of him using one in each hand.
Perhaps one of the most iconic examples of dual wielding is that of the Wild West gunslinger. The era of the six-shooter is where the act of dual wielding actually made the most sense, and so there are some historical accounts of a gunslinger firing away revolvers akimbo. In the late 19th century, ambidextrous US lawman Bat Masterson was reported to avenge his brother's murder as he was seen taking a revolver in each hand, for he shoots readily with both. Followed by the lawman jumping square against the door with both feet as he sprang inside, firing immediately right and left, as 4 dropped dead in a shorter time than it requires to tell it. Quite the account, I'm sure you'll agree, one that almost reads like a Wild West version of Max Payne. A common thread between these stories and more is that it was a method only employed in close quarters or frantic, dire situations.
I have 2 guns, 1 for each of you.
In a tactical sense, there was no real advantage to dual wielding, and there is even less so when we look at the modern era, where using your other hand to support the weapon is going to offer a much higher volume of accurate firepower, especially when comparing a high-capacity semi-automatic pistol with your Old West revolver.
Shame.
But while history offers potentially more tales of dual wielding than expected, even the scattered entries across archives pales in comparison to how pop culture represents the akimbo shooter. While next to non-existent in the real world, the flashy showmanship and doubled-up damage that dual-wielding weapons offered meant it was a perfect fit for anything that wanted to lean into the spectacle of twin muzzle flashes. To showcase the breadth of time that dual-wielding pistols has existed in humanity's creative works, the first time fiction references the feat is actually in the 1862 novel Les Miserables by Victor Hugo. Early Wild West silent films also started to showcase the phenomenon, a trend that would follow Western movies through its golden age and beyond. Dual-wielding firearms has been an element that has appeared throughout TV and cinema, from iconic examples like John Woo's Hard-Boiled, Equilibrium and The Matrix, to The Terminator, the Star Wars franchise, and far, far beyond. While in video games, developers have been giving players the opportunity to double up on their firepower as early as the 1980s. The Wild West classic Gunsmoke followed similar Western media tropes, with the hero being the quintessential dual-wielding gunman in Capcom's 1985 scrolling shooter. But as games progressed and players were put behind the gun, it didn't take long for pixelated pistols to be joined by a partner. The popularity for the first-person shooter genre, born from the successes of 1992's Wolfenstein 3D and the original Doom in 1993, led to Bungie's Marathon, which was released in 1994, and with it came the first time FPS players could dual-wield their guns. As the pistols in Wolfenstein 3D and Doom were quickly replaced and often lacked any utility beyond the first level, Marathon gave their starting 45 Magnum Mega Class pistols an extended life through the game by simply adding another, while also giving players a reason to explore and find that secondary sidearm. And in 1996, with a pistol in each hand, players were introduced to one of the most iconic video game characters of all time. Lara Croft's choice of armament became a recognizable and quintessential element to both the character and Tomb Raider's gameplay for years. That is until 2013 and the release of the Survivor trilogy, where the bow became Lara's new iconic weapon across the survival action reboots. But across the 90s, early 2000s, and into the modern day, video games would constantly use akimbo weapons to double up on the action and spectacle players have at their disposal. Hell, I'm sure anyone who's ever played a light gun game like Time Crisis in the arcade has spent an extra token in an attempt to dual wield those pink and blue blasters. Players quickly became familiar with the trends and staples of dual wielding, and developers were more than happy to capitalize on that desire. Maybe the extra firepower and muzzle flashes appeals to a base level in us all, especially when the weapons are more ridiculous than they are realistic. Perhaps it's a desire for the feeling of more power, or even for the sake of variety, where the use of dual wielding can really change the gameplay experience a game offers, while also offering another level of action, style, and flair. Regardless, the advantages are obvious. Double the weapons means double the bolts, bullets, or buckshot you're able to send down range, which can often be enough to put a virtual firefight in your favor, at least in situations where accuracy by volume of fire can outplay aimed and considered shots. Since Call of Duty adopted Akimbo as a customization option in 2009's Modern Warfare 2, it has been a source of both adoration and frustration by the player base. Across the franchise, many of the overpowered loadouts have featured a dual-wielding firearm of some form, with some giving life to an underperforming weapon by simply giving it a deadly dance partner. Thousands of gamers of a certain vintage will certainly remember how the Akimbo 1887 shotguns dominated Modern Warfare 2, especially before their range was nerfed into the ground. Although on the other end of the spectrum, outside of the few exceptional examples that make it into meta, Akimbo has mostly been an overlooked unlock, or simply a waste of an attachment slot. Most commonly, you're stuck to a matched pair of weapons when dual wielding, but that isn't the case for every shooter, with the extra firepower a second hand can provide opening up new strategies for players to experiment with. Marrying an assault rifle with a heavy automatic shotgun is exceedingly daft, but an oh so effective combination in Wolfenstein: The New Colossus, and I can still remember how devastating the plasma pistol and SMG combo was in Halo 3. Blows to your accuracy and recoil stats, or even removing the ability to aim, are common ways developers try to balance out their akimbo firearms, often forcing the player into the stance of hip firing. There are, however, some concessions to this trend too. Some games will put each weapon on a different trigger, allowing you to fire your weapons in isolation of one another, while others will fire sequentially and perhaps offer some rudimentary increase to accuracy and aim, even if it's as simple as zooming in on a target. Killing Floor 2 adds some more implied skill by allowing players multiple options when aiming pairs of pistols, and allowing them to retain some form of accuracy. But when fighting a horde of Zeds, you're bound to hit something. Accuracy and aiming considerations are often largely less important when the point of view changes to the third person, with games like the Max Payne series or Red Dead Redemption 2 focusing more on their story and the spectacle of their gunplay rather than balance or feasibility. That doesn't mean that they or any other shooter are immune to akimbo shooting's biggest hurdle though. That is how to go about reloading two weapons with only two hands.
I think we've seen more creativeness in the world of fiction in this respect than we have in real life, simply because there's no need to do it in real life. Where real life has to deal with it is the movies, and we've seen some interesting attempts like the Tomb Raider backpack. We've seen it done for effect in Equilibrium, where you've got the weird bobblehead mags that are thrown down the corridor ahead of Christian Bale for no particular reason other than it looks cool. The biggest problem by far is you haven't got a free hand. The major advantage of a pistol is negated by having another one of them in your other hand.
Since the implementation of dual wielding, reload time has almost always been used as a drawback to the increased firepower. With an extra gun and extra bullets comes an extra long reload, which makes a lot of sense, as in reality the process would be, at its best, very awkward to pull off. As weapons and animations became more detailed, reloading your virtual firearm became more of an involved and realistic process as your player model manipulated slides and ejected spent magazines. And yet in the case of dual wielding, the majority of games, including many released today, have half of the exceedingly implausible reloading process taking place off the screen and out of a player's view, supplemented only by sounds to imply movement and operations. But considering how hard the process is to accomplish in reality, it's no surprise that it's a challenge to animate and implement in our games. Virtual reality goes some way into giving players a sense of how difficult it is to effectively use and reload multiple weapons at once. But even here, where we have floating holsters, magazines sucked into weapons, slides that can be operated without any physical strain, and pistols piled on top of each other, you're still pretty far removed from the difficulty of this feat's reality. Many games feature some more far-fetched methods of reloading, but due to their setting and gameplay, they never feel out of place in their respective virtual worlds, where even bizarre or stylized reloads can sometimes end up feeling considered or even almost authentic. Although for the most part, especially in games like this, they need to be cool. Killing Floor 2 is a game that has put a lot of thought into how their weapon pairs are reloaded, with slick John Wick-esque tactical reloads available, and Hunt Showdown's offering of Wild West weaponry has its own selection of different animations, from the slow, tension-building revolvers to some that have a little more style and flair. While we've established that the act of dual wielding is largely a pop culture trope and its use throughout history is limited to stories few and far between or acts of desperation, we still wanted to get a sense of its real-world utility, process, and drawbacks with a little hands-on. Jonathan agreed to make an attempt with a pair of magazine-fed pistols, but I must stress that this was done in a controlled environment by a professional and with a safety and range warden overseeing proceedings. So I want to stress that no one should attempt this themselves.
So what you won't necessarily see is a lot of preamble here, because this is a real challenge. This is not how pistols are supposed to be shot. A lot of this was trying to figure out how close can I put the pistols so that they don't hit each other when they recoil. There's not a lot your wrists can do to control the recoil of even 9mm. And you see from the first shot there, that Glock is, especially my left hand, is coming backing up with a fair bit of force. And had I held those two pistols too close together, they'd have hit each other. Somehow I could not hold them out at arm's length and do this. I had to have sort of bent elbows. So that's affecting my ability to control the recoil of these individual shots. And I'm trying to be accurate, so I'm trying to get a sight picture each time without taking too long, and I'm having to alternate between guns. So now, of course, in the movies and, of course, video games, the whole idea here is to sort of double your firepower. So you're not supposed to care as much about hitting the target as I was here. But I was trying to be effective while firing two guns. Trying to aim at the red dot, of course. So we've got, what, a 50% hit rate there if we treat the pistol target as what we're shooting at. That's about as effective as you could possibly be firing two pistols at the same time. Of course, pretty much doing away with any value in having a pistol in each hand, because the only reason to do that would be just a sheer weight of rapid fire in the direction of the opponent. So not hugely effective and doesn't really achieve what firing two pistols, whether or not you're going R or not, is actually supposed to achieve. So it's pretty pointless, but fun to try and interesting.
Pretty awkward.
While I could have talked about how dual wielding wasn't feasible in reality, seeing Jonathan shoot in person and talking about his experience doing so also allows us to further underline that this isn't an element that has any real world application. Considering its life in pop culture, it's not surprising that dual wielding weapons is a popular choice for players. Going guns akimbo is a reliable and effective way to let the player feel like that action hero, dial up the intensity of virtual shootouts, or add further variety, effectiveness, or utility to often weaker video game sidearms. It's such a familiar trope that dual wielding has not only been used for action-packed gameplay, but to benefit a game's story and characters too. Seeing a gunslinger or assassin with guns akimbo tells us that they're deadly, efficient, a master of their firearm, and a force to be reckoned with, all without a word. As many franchises have opted to become a little more grounded or authentic in their gunplay and characters, we're seeing fewer titles implementing dual wielding, with both Lara Croft and Agent 47 splitting their pair of iconic pistols in half. With current video game trends and tastes, perhaps dual wielding has had its gaming heyday, but I can't see players ever getting tired of firing away with a gun in each hand. And I believe that because of this eternal desire for over-the-top action, wherever games and movies put the rule of cool above all else, it's there where wielding guns akimbo will always have a home.
There's just something about it. I think it shows force of will, and of course just the sheer spectacle of double muzzle flash, the fact that no normal person could do this, therefore this action hero is the guy because he can hit the enemy with both pistols at the same time. I think we're impressed by anyone that is truly ambidextrous and can use both their hands equally well. So it's just always going to look cool. There's just something about it.
Thank you so much for watching this episode of Loadout on one of the more eclectic phenomena in our games. If you enjoyed, make sure to like the video, subscribe, and of course, check out all the other episodes of this series. We have episodes covering everything from sniper rifles and the AK-47 to suppressors and the minigun, with more to come, and of course our weekly episodes of Firearms Expert Reacts, where we show our friends at the Royal Armouries a slew of weapons to break down. If there are any other weapons or subjects that you want to see an episode on, be sure to leave your thoughts in the comments section below, or you can reach out to me directly on Twitter @IrregularDave. But until next time, thank you so much for watching.